Welcome to the Diabetics Doing Things podcast. We've been telling the amazing stories of type 1 diabetics all across the world since 2015, and we have over 1,000 years of living with T1D on the podcast. The interviews range from incredible feats to everyday victories, and we celebrate them all just the same. Thanks for listening, and if you want to get involved even further, just send me an email at rob@diabeticsdoingthings.com. Hello, ladies and germs. Getting ready for the holidays here, holiday season 2020. This is a very special episode because it is time sensitive. Today's guest is Quinn Nystrom. She's a person with diabetes, was diagnosed at age 13. She also has a brother with type 1. She's from Minnesota, and what you're going to learn in this story is that Quinn is running for Congress in the 8th District of Minnesota. And now you might be saying, hey, I don't live in Minnesota. There's no way I can support Quinn, but I really hope that she's able to win. Well, good news, you can help. And when you're running a campaign like Quinn's, you need the support of individual donors. So I am currently pledging $50. I'm going to go donate on Quinn's website tonight. And I need you guys to do the same so that we can show how the type 1 community supports one of its own. So her website is Quinn for Congress. That's QUINNFOR Congress.com. Quinn for Congress. It's linked in the show notes, so you're able to find it. Even a small donation, like $10, goes a long way in a campaign like this and will go to support someone with diabetes being in Congress to advocate on our behalf. Obviously, there is an insulin crisis right now in the U.S., and that is just the start of addressing some of the challenges that people with diabetes and other chronic illnesses face in this country today. So, listen to Quinn's episode, support people doing things for people with diabetes, and go to QuinnForCongress.com and donate today. Here's the episode. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Diabetics Doing Things. We're telling the amazing stories of people with diabetes from all across the world. My very special guest today, you may have seen, like I did, at a big story this summer, Quinn Nystrom from Minnesota, a person with type 1 diabetes and also running for Congress. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob.
Well, I am really excited to dive into today's conversation. Just to put it plainly, you've been busy over your life with diabetes, and I think for people who are experiencing the life of an advocate, there's pretty much no stone unturned on your side over the last 25 years. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your personal diagnosis and life with diabetes and how you have prioritized advocacy along that journey?
Yeah, my story started when my younger brother, Will, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 5. My parents came into the living room, told my older brother, Thor, and I that our brother had been diagnosed, and they brought us to the local hospital where he had been admitted into the pediatrics unit. And being his big older sister, I was in the 5th grade. I was 10 years old at the time. I sat with them in the hospital bed, and I made a promise to him that I would do whatever I could to help find a cure for diabetes, and I would do whatever I could to help improve his life with diabetes. I don't think I knew exactly what that meant at that time, but what I started doing at 10 was knocking on neighborhood doors in my neighborhood in Baxter, Minnesota. I come from a small rural community in central Minnesota. So I was raising money for diabetes, and then I was going into area classrooms in my elementary school, talking about what diabetes was and what it wasn't, because I saw a lot of people were quite ignorant about diabetes. People were making fun of Will, thinking that my parents gave him too much sugar, that he, didn't exercise enough. It was like they thought he should be a hamster on a hamster wheel or something. And so I wanted to try to dispel some of those misconceptions. And then, I was quite shocked 2.5 years later at the age of 13 when I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I was so surprised. And, as a 13-year-old girl, all I wanted to do was fit in, blend in, that the last thing I wanted was to be diagnosed with a chronic incurable illness. And so I was quite shell shocked by the diagnosis, um, and didn't want to tell anybody I had diabetes, and had about a year of just kind of mourning and where I was in denial. And it wasn't until I went to a diabetes camp in Hudson, Wisconsin, named Camp Needlepoint, where I really found kind of the power of perspective and realized, I didn't get the choice to get type 1 diabetes, but I certainly got the choice of how I was going to react to getting it. And that's when I decided to redouble down on that initial promise to Will, and decided to redouble down on my efforts. And so that's kind of the origin of what got me first personally involved in diabetes work.
Well, and I mean, there's so much to unpack there, and I think I want to focus on a couple things just to, in your experience, obviously, that 13 years old is a very, very tough age to be diagnosed with anything, much less a, incurable chronic illness, like you said, and how being different at that age can just seem so insurmountable, especially for a young person. Were you able to rely on your relationship with your brother at all, during that time, or what was that time like for you and your family?
It was incredibly difficult. One, the pediatrician who had diagnosed Will in our small town, my parents had asked him, what is the likelihood that another one of our children could be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes? That was back in 1996. He had told my parents, that would be nearly impossible, and your family will be on the cover of the New England Journal of Medicine if a second child is diagnosed with type 1. And so, my parents, were equally shocked, than when I was diagnosed. And I think, didn't quite know what to say when I got that diagnosis. And I think I thought, like, well, this is Will's disease, not my disease. And, I loved my brother. We were very close, but we were 6 years apart. And Will had sort of gotten on with his life despite getting diagnosed with diabetes. And so, I felt like we had much different experiences because for Will's only reality is that he's had type 1 diabetes. I had lived this large portion of my life as a quote unquote, I say quote unquote normal person, whatever
Sure.
that means, right? Because I don't think there is really a normal person, but
Yeah, show me what that looks like, and I'll
yeah,
be able to
exactly,
show you a
right?
million
The older
different
I
stories.
get, I know that's not a thing. But I knew what it was like not to have to take multiple injections a day, multiple finger pokes. And so I wanted that life back. I didn't want this new reality. And being from a small town, it's not like there were multiple girls my age with it. So it was really painful. And when I was diagnosed, I was made fun of in school. Um, People thought I was contagious. They wanted to move away from me in classrooms. Um, there was bullying that occurred. And I was very insecure and I didn't have a voice. I didn't know what to say,
Right.
you know? And it was a tough year where I fell into, a major depression.
Well, and I think that's something that speaks to an issue that I talk about in one of my talks, and we'll talk about how we met in person in Minneapolis in a bit. But the T1D Renaissance is the title of one of my talks, like living in the T1D Renaissance. And so for you in a small town at that particular time, isolation used to go hand in hand with a type 1 diabetes diagnosis if it wasn't a strong immediate local community around you. And, so for you, that becomes your normal, right? Having to explain to people, dealing with the bullying, dealing with the lack of information. And honestly, I think I tell people this all the time. You couldn't pay me enough money. You couldn't pay me all the money in the world to go back to being a seventh grader because kids in seventh grade are relentless and they don't really have any sort of concept as to the power of their words. And they will focus on anything that makes someone else different and point it out and sort of make them feel less than. How did you, dealing with that, like, dealing with that deep depression, how did you find your way through that and really find your footing to kind of become the advocate that you become and the person that you become?
Honestly, looking back and reflecting, now that I've had type 1 for over 20 years, I look back and it was honestly my mother about a year after my diagnosis coming to me and telling me that she had found out about this diabetes camp called Camp Needlepoint and that she was going to send me there. And, I was furious. I just thought it was going to ruin my life forever. I did not want to go to this place. Um, but, she put her foot down and said, "You're going." And I went kicking and screaming to this camp. But it's honestly what saved my life because it was the first time I was around other girls my age, for 7 days straight who had learned to sort of get on with it and had learned, they were from other, small towns in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and they had figured out a way to deal with it. They had also learned to kind of date with diabetes or tell guys, right, that they had diabetes, which seems so like just an out of this world concept for me as a now 14-year-old girl. And it was like, wow, if they can do it, I can do it. And I kind of learned like, okay, my pancreas shut down. Like, so what? Like, what's your problem? Like we all have these issues. Like, that's mine. Big deal. Like, we all have something. And so I honestly went back, to the ninth grade that year and was just like, okay, like I'm coming out of the closet, out of the diabetes closet. And I just didn't care. And I think in a way, it wasn't that I wasn't made fun of anymore because that's not true. I still to this day I don't want to say I get bullied. I still get very ignorant comments on a weekly basis. Um, Even running for Congress now, which we'll talk about later. Um, so I'm not immune to that. But what I'll say is, I think in a way, they just don't bother you as much when you don't give them as much power, you know?
Sure.
And I also was able to find my voice. And so when I realized, like, these people don't know anything, do you know what I mean? Like, I kind of feel bad for them. They must not have a lot of friends if this is all they want to say about people. And I gave them less power. It really was able to help me along the way. And then at 16, I applied for and was chosen to be the National Youth Advocate for the American Diabetes Association and traveled all over the country, speaking at the White House, the U.S. Capitol, at, gosh, a dozen diabetes camps, at diabetes expos, at fundraisers, and realized that really by me deciding to speak out and be public, that I could make a difference. And in a way, that was the best therapy for me because I felt like I wasn't giving power to those bullies any longer, you know? And what they said, really, I just ended up using it as good material in my speeches, ultimately.
It's funny how, in the comedy world, they say like tragedy plus time equals comedy.
Yeah.
And, I think they didn't realize that they were just giving you more ammunition that was going to resonate with a room full of adults who were there to support you and cheer you on, right?
100%.
So was that sort of your first experience, I guess, in the public eye, and obviously speaking and going to these incredible venues and historic places, and feeling like, this is maybe what you were supposed to be doing?
Yeah. I mean, it was, I had met the National Youth Advocate that very first time I went to Camp Needlepoint. And so actually that very next year when I was 15, I applied. I wasn't selected. But living with diabetes, right, I learned an important life lesson, which is, as people with diabetes, we just learn to never give up, right? We have some really bad days, but we also have good days. And like I've always said with diabetes, like I just try to work to make the next best decision and not beat myself up over like waking up with a super high blood sugar or going low or whatever. And so not getting to be the National Youth Advocate the first time, I just was like, okay, well, I'm going to try to improve my application. And that next year I was selected. And I actually found out then that I had been the first runner up the year before, which I had no idea. And that was then the first time that I was being sent to all these places. And people were, I mean, before I had done it on a local level, but now people were really listening to me, and it was US senators and US representatives. And, I was just a small town girl from a town of 5,000 people. Um, I didn't have any initials beyond my name. I wasn't a celebrity. And it showed me that if you told your story very authentically and truthfully, that you could make a difference, that you could change policy, you could change people's minds, you could raise awareness about diabetes and how people live with it and the struggles that we face. And that was just an incredible lesson as a 16-year-old girl.
Absolutely. And I think, outside of just learning that lesson outside of diabetes, just as a young person and the confidence that can give you, I love what you said about not knowing that you were first runner up, where, there's really, if a person can't commit to it, that you're the winner at that point. And I have spoken a little bit on this podcast and sort of at length about how diabetes makes you better at failure, because some days you wake up and your blood sugar is out of whack and you feel bad, but you still have things to do. So you make a decision and you either treat a low blood sugar or treat a high blood sugar or whatever the case, or overcome your insurance delay in your prescription or your prior authorization or whatever or what have you, and you continue to move on. And so many people, I think, are paralyzed by failure in their life. And I just know so many people with diabetes that understand that failure is not final. And so that's super cool that in this second year, you had the courage to apply again and you win it. And now I'm going to fast forward a little bit, because I believe this applies like to your, kind of current campaign in a way. Talk about, I believe you ran for Congress in a different district, if I'm not mistaken, in 2016. What did you learn from that experience that you've used in your advocacy and in your campaign in going into 2020?
Yeah, so I ran for the Minnesota House back in 2016. And again, I ran because living with a chronic illness, living with a pre-existing condition, I am passionate about people having affordable and accessible health care. We shouldn't live in the richest country in the world and literally have 1 in 4 people with diabetes rationing their medication because they can't afford it. And I know in my own home state of Minnesota, know that we've had just 3 people reportedly actually report that they passed away due to insulin rationing just this summer. I mean, to me, that is a complete tragedy and totally preventable. And so I ran for the Minnesota House because I wanted to help fix our healthcare system. And, I did not win back in 2016. But what I learned was, winning is not just all about winning on election night. Winning is also about the whole campaign, because you also get to meet a whole new audience. You're meeting people, you're door knocking, you're at different campaign stops, and you're getting to still tell your message and talk to people and listen to their stories that you would never really have gotten the opportunity to meet before. And another thing I learned, I come from a smaller rural community. A lot of people in my smaller rural community do not see a lot of young women run for public office. Okay. Now, I don't think somebody should vote for me just because I'm female. I'll say that. I think people should vote for me because I'm fully qualified to hold that public office. But what I'll say is, I, I thought I was running in 2016, and, that I'd be out campaigning and mainly talking to the 18 plus voters, and that's who you're trying to make the impact with. But what I found was that I was also making a huge impact on young girls and teenagers in my district who just did not see younger women running for public office, or women in general running for public office, and what that meant to them. And there was actually a party that was held in my honor a week after the election, so I lost. If you would have seen a video from this party that actually was recorded, there were 4 little girls who had been at various campaign events through the year. When I walked into that door, they were jumping up and down with excitement as I walked through that door. You would have thought that this was an election night victory party, right? The room was packed and people were screaming and cheering, and these girls were in the front jumping up and down. And what I learned was that to these 4 little girls, it was like I had won the governor of Minnesota. And so if I would have taken that night of the election as a defeat, I would be letting those girls down. Because every single word that I said during that campaign, everything I did with my actions, that impacted them in a tremendous way, and impacts them also today when I see them out in my community, that they saw somebody like themselves run for public office so that they too know that one day that they too can run for public office. And so, that was just an incredible thing that I learned that I didn't think. I really didn't think about that, when I ran in 2016. And, deciding to run for Congress in 2020, that wasn't something that I grew up thinking like, oh, one day I'd love to run for Congress, then I'm going to run for president. That was never anything in my mind. Even earlier this year, I would not have said I was going to run for Congress.
And what do you think, as you and your team, obviously now, looking back, was it how much did the insulin for all and like insulin affordability crisis in the U.S., how much did that impact your decision to actually, make that jump? And like you said, you haven't been dreaming of this your whole life. You don't identify as a person who wanted to be president, in your elementary school days, and that was who you were going to be. How did those play a part? Did that shift your, shift your goals and say, I'm going to do this to be a part of something bigger?
I would say almost 100%. I would not be running for the United States Congress if, when I had met with my recently elected Congressman, Pete Stauber, when I was out in D.C., so ever since I was, the National Youth Advocate back in 2002, I have gone out to D.C. nearly every single year in the springtime and met with whoever the Minnesota contingency was. I meet with Republicans, Independents, Democrats, whoever, because I just want legislation to be passed to keep people with diabetes alive. I sat down and met with him, and I had asked him 3 simple things, I thought. One, I said, this insulin affordability thing has become a crisis in this country, and we have people dying. I asked him to sign on to some pieces of legislation that had been proposed at that point. And he said, yep, you'll find no greater diabetes advocate in me. My nephew has type 1 diabetes. Second thing I asked him is if he would protect people with pre-existing conditions on the Affordable Care Act. Since I'm a small business owner, I access my health insurance through there. That is something I absolutely depend on. And number 3, I asked him if he would hold a diabetes roundtable insulin, listening session back in our Minnesota's 8th district, because most people who can't afford their health care, their insulin, will never be able to fly out to DC to meet with him. I was out there on a scholarship. So he said, yes, I will do that. Now, clearly, I'm running for Congress now, which means I followed up with him on every single one of those things. He lied to me on every single one. If he would have followed through on all 3 of those, like he had promised me, I would not be running for Congress. I had no plans to run for Congress. I think, as you know, Rob, I was very busy, leading the efforts in Minnesota, as the chapter leader for the Minnesota Insulin for All group, to pass legislation on the state level to help save the lives of people who couldn't afford it. I was leading caravans, over to Canada to simply keeping people alive. This wasn't, in my plans for 2019, 2020. But when I found out that he had 0 plans to help anybody access affordable life-saving medication, I felt like I had no other choice but to throw my name in the hat and to run against him. Because for far too long, people like us with diabetes have, I feel like, just been cashed in like cash cows. And we have had companies, just benefit off of us.
Yeah.
And they have raised the prices multiple times a year, and they give us, as you know, a plethora of excuses. And to me, we need somebody in Congress who's going to speak up and hold their feet to the fire. And who better than somebody with diabetes who's already done that as an advocate? Because
Absolutely.
frankly, I just don't see it. I don't see somebody like myself in Congress fighting for us loud enough and making traction. And so that's why I felt like I have to run for Congress. The clock is up. I can't let another person in this country die from that. I can't.
Absolutely. And I think, going back even 2 years ago when, I interviewed Elizabeth. She was then Rowley, but the leader of T1 International, founder of T1 International. And we talked about the insulin crisis in the United States and really globally as well. And then, at the end of 2017, how many stories were there that came out of children, young adults, and adults who died because they couldn't afford their diabetes? And I thought at that point, I was like, okay, well, these deaths are senseless, but they were getting the publication that they needed, and there are these foundations that are being set up, and hopefully this will really reinforce and draw a line in the sand for people who don't have diabetes but are making these decisions to hold these people accountable. And here we are almost 2 years later, and it's only gotten worse.
Correct.
So, there's more, blood on hands, I think people throw around as hyperbole, but in this case, it's very poignant. People are dying because the price of their life-saving medication is too high and inaccessible in, like you said, the richest country in the world. So, yeah, I think, like you mentioned earlier with those 2 young girls who were at your, your party, who you felt like you could have won, you're representing them. And I think in a different way now you're representing people with diabetes and people who are parents and loved ones and caretakers of people with diabetes to say, hey, there is a voice now who really understands and, can advocate for you at the highest level where actually changes can be made.
Yeah, because what I found was, being an advocate, I've been in the diabetes advocacy world for 23 years. I've been on the federal advocacy level for 17 years. I have fought for these pieces of legislation, and I am sick and tired of them not getting passed. And so to me, it was like, well, what else can I do? Well, I can run for Congress. And I felt like talking to enough people, they were ready to support somebody with type 1 diabetes as a strong advocate to run for Congress. And I felt like, again, we just have no more time to wait. This is such a crisis in our country, and we are the only country in the world that has this problem. And the only people that can fix this problem, we can get as upset as we want at the pharmaceutical companies, the health insurance companies, the pharmacy benefit managers. And trust me, I do get upset at them. But the only people who can really fix this are the elected officials, because they have to pass laws in order to make those companies play within the sandbox. And right now, sadly, those companies are playing within the sandbox that our government has put in place for them. You know what I
Absolutely.
if we're just having an honest conversation about it, our government has set up a system where they are allowed to price gouge us. So we need to elect people to office that don't take money from pharmaceutical companies, from health insurance companies, so their hands won't be tied, and that will really hold those companies feet to the fire and say, we need massive reform when it comes to this, because we we need to do something different to get these prices dropped, or otherwise we're going to continue to see people die.
Well, and I think this is a obviously a very poignant, subject for people with diabetes. But I think your story also has tremendous potential for, on an advocacy level to say, hey, for someone who's been really pushing and feeling like they're doing what they can do as a citizen to, make their priorities known and tell a story to local representatives and get involved, and then feeling like they're just spinning their wheels. The next step is to, follow Quinn Nystrom's footprint and say, I'm going to stand up and be a voice for people with diabetes in my district and run for public office. Do you feel like, for you, now leading the charge on that, as a person with a chronic illness with a vested interest in this type of work, do you hope to, obviously, we're focused on 2020 right now, but for people who feel like there's a little bit of Quinn Nystrom in them, what would you say to those people who are on the fence of doing something like this?
Gosh, I mean, the people who are on the fence, I mean, one, I always say to people too, right? Insulin is simply a case study. Um, you know, Insulin is just one drug in the plethora of high prescription drug costs that we have in this country. And we we need to see that as a country, it's not just about lowering the cost of insulin. And even if somebody is not impacted by diabetes whatsoever, I think most people in America care um, about being fiscally responsible on some level. And so if we don't take care of, about insulin affordability or about some of these other high prescription drug costs, what we're going to see, and I just talk about insulin because I know it the best, but like for people who can't afford insulin, right? The 1 in 4 people who are currently rationing, when people can't afford their insulin and they're rationing, we know their blood sugars are so high. Most often they don't have money, so their only option is to go into the emergency room when their blood sugars are skyrocket high. Well, oftentimes then they're not going to have the money to even pay for that visit, which those visits then are crippling our healthcare system. And so I say to people, really then what we're saying is, do you want to pay now to fix, the insulin affordability issue and some of these other high prescription drug costs, or do we want to pay more later? And in my opinion, why wouldn't we just want to pay now, fight for saving human lives,
Yeah. What greater cause than can you find than that?
Right? I, it's very hard for me to see the other side of the argument here, because you're going to also lose lives and pay much more later. So, you know.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think, and that rings true. I think especially for when you're coming to the table as a person with diabetes, like that is the clear explanation. If death and saving lives uh, don't get people over on your side from the start, I think that's obviously the the best follow up. So
Yeah.
obviously, like I think this episode and this interview and this conversation is going to I think inspire people who are not inside your district but still want to support you, to kind of come to your aid and believe in you, and I want to make sure that I give you the opportunity to plug where they can do that. I know your website is quinnforcongress.com, and fundraising is a huge part of winning a political campaign, especially when you're not taking money from big insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. So how can people support you?
Yeah. So, the truth about running for Congress is, in order to run for Congress and be successful, especially when you are going to challenge an incumbent, who takes nearly 50% of his money from corporations, is you have to be able to raise money. And I think that is a sad reality of the political system we have. But I'm scrappy and I'm a fighter. I think I learned that from living with diabetes all these years. And so I'm willing to work hard, um, so that we can put somebody with type 1 diabetes who's going to fight hard on this insulin affordability issue in Congress. But in order to do that, I'm going to need each and every one of your help. And so if people would be willing, to contribute 10, 20, $50, whatever amount they're able, and they can go to my congressional website, my congressional campaign website, which is quinnforcongress.com. It's all spelled out, all lowercase, and Quinn is spelled Quinn, and then it's FOR. You can go there. You'll see the donate button, and that would be a huge help. And it also shows, too, for our campaign, that no matter what the donation size is, it shows that we have strong grassroots support, from a lot of people. And that shows a strong groundswell of support. So as many individuals as we can get to donate, that shows a great deal, when we have to file our first quarterly report, which will be filed on December 31st at midnight. So that's going to be our first deadline. And so I would so appreciate any of your support. And a second way you can support the campaign is by just spreading the word about the campaign on social media, posting about why you support our campaign, why it's important that we get a candidate with type 1 diabetes and who's a strong advocate for insulin affordability in Congress, and sharing our campaign's website, because that's how we're going to be able to do it, is by spreading word of mouth and getting the word out about the campaign.
Well, I knew when I met you in Minneapolis, and our paths crossed in person, that I was hopeful that we'd be able to work together. And so I'm going to make sure to get this episode out as quickly as possible. Tomorrow is going to be the release date, which is very rare for this podcast. But I obviously, with the short time we have remaining in the year, I want to give people with diabetes a chance to support you as much as possible before that report is due at midnight on December 31st. So you guys will be working on New Year's Eve, I take it.
We will be. We will be working till the clock strikes midnight. So, yes, I'll take a day off on the 1st.
I love it. Start 2020 off the right way. The 1st is also my diaversary, so I'll be 15 years with diabetes on the 1st of January. So just a fun little personal note to add to that. So
yes, happy diaversary.
Thank you very much. So Quinn, I want everybody to follow you as well on Instagram and to continue to spread that message. We're going to publish this episode. And I think, honestly, for me, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your campaign today to do this podcast, and for continuing to inspire people like me who, feel like at times they're frustrated by the progress that they're able to make with their advocacy, both locally and nationally, and taking matters into their own hands and just being an extremely inspirational person to follow. And, wish you the best of luck, and will support you as much as I can from afar. And just looking forward to seeing you roll through on election day with hopefully those 4 girls at your celebration party in 2020.
I hope so too. So yes, thank you so much, and thank you for having me on. I appreciate all the support and the well wishes.
If you are still listening at the end of this podcast, I just want to say thank you. 4 years ago, it was the end of 2015, and I was recording the first 5 episodes of this podcast. And now 4 years later, 22 Type 1 Nation summits for JDRF, lots of advocacy work, lots of Instagram posts, lots of podcast guests, lots of travel, even got to go overseas at one point. This has been an amazing journey. This year, we did some really cool stuff. Started going to diabetes camps for kids to speak, spoke at a ton of JDRF Type 1 Nation summits, traveled all over, released my first email series. I was like 15,000 words that you can subscribe to at diabeticsdoingthings.com/emails, and continue to publish podcasts along the way. This podcast is going to stay. It has been my primary platform throughout the last 4 years, and I want that to continue. So thank you so much for your support and for the support of our sponsors. So this is Rob Howe. I am signing off, not for the rest of the year. We have a few more episodes, but I just wanted to end this episode with some gratitude to you and the rest of the diabetes community. So keep doing things, keep being awesome people with diabetes, and I cannot wait to share the next things that we're going to do together in 2020.